What's up guys, Kyle here again, and welcome back to another episode of FAQ'N Friday. Officially starting next week, I am going to be doing a viewers comments episode as I asked you guys on my last FAQ'N Friday episode if that's something that you guys would be interested in, and most of you said yes, and I think it'll be a nice way to kind of keep Fridays fresh for everybody, myself, you guys. I just want to make sure that the content does not get stale, and I'm going to start combing through the comments on the videos over the next week and finding some stuff to reply to. Hopefully there will be some great questions or comments to reply to in there. I may also take it upon myself to roast a comment or two just for fun. We'll have a good time with it. So yeah, next week will be officially the very first viewers comments episode. So make sure you guys don't miss that. With that being said, let's jump into some questions. Question number 1 comes from Greaseauced25. Have you ever thought about making IRs of some of your less common cabs? Every other company out there has Mesa V30 IRs, but you've got some rare things that I don't see talked about a lot that might sound cool. Thank you for your question, man. And yes, I have absolutely thought about making impulse responses of a lot of my cabs. I do have a lot of cabs that aren't really featured on a lot of the impulse responses that you find from super common companies, or a lot of the industry standard companies that are pumping out some great stuff. I know I've mentioned multiple times about teaming up with a couple other people to maybe release some impulse response cab packs, but unfortunately the last few months have just been way busier than I ever imagined. And it's a good busy. It's a great busy. But unfortunately, it is really time consuming to produce entire cabinet IR packs. And I just have not been able to find the time to do it. So unfortunately, that has not come to fruition yet. So in the meantime, I may actually end up just making my own individual little tiny impulse response packs of certain cabinets that I own and providing them to you guys, because I do have a lot of cool cabs and I'd like to be able to capture those so you guys would be able to use them and so I can use them for my own recording purposes. So I think moving forward, I actually have talked to Miko at ML Sound Lab, and he said if I wanted any advice on capturing impulse responses properly, that he'd be happy to help me out. So I may end up talking to Miko and seeing if he can help me out, and then that way I can offer you guys some small impulse response packs based on a few of my obscure cabs here and there. I think that'd be kind of a cool thing to do. Maybe I will start to offer them for free to my Patreon members, and then offer them up for a small fee to those who are not part of my Patreon membership. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely let me know down below in the comments. I also still have a Kemper here at my disposal and thought about making some profiles of some of my more popular amps and some of my harder to get amps. So again, if that's something that you guys are interested in, I may offer some Kemper profile packs of some of my amps. So put it down in the comments if you guys think that that might be something that you're interested in. I'm really interested in doing it, but I know that it's very time consuming, so I don't really want to sink a ton of time into it unless it's something that you guys are really going to be into. So just let me know and I'll take it from there. Satan's Offspring asks, thoughts on biasing an amp? Do you do it every time you change tubes? That is a fantastic question. Thank you for leaving that, man. So when it comes to biasing amps, there are certain amps, and I'm not even going to go into the terminology because I get it wrong every single time, so I make an ass of myself enough as it is on this channel. But there are certain amps like Mesa dual rectifiers and PV5150s where you do not have to bias the amp because the bias is set in a way that it really can't be altered. So when you're retubing amps like those, you want to go to a reputable source like Doug's Tubes or Euro Tubes. Tell them what amp you have so they know what power tube and what range and what rating of power tube to provide for that amp so that it'll be within spec, and all you have to do is plug and play. Then there are other amps such as Marshalls, Friedmans, Splons. Pretty much most tube amps do require a bias when you change power tubes. Unless you order from a source that has their own ratings, like Groove Tube has their own ratings, and I believe that TAD and Apex, those tube suppliers all have their own ratings. They will match a quad of tubes and then they'll put a rating on it. So if you know the rating that are on those tubes, you can go back to that same supplier, order that same power tube with that same rating, and then you don't have to rebias. But if you're just buying tubes from a random source or you're switching over to a completely different tube, then yeah, you're gonna wanna rebias on an amp if it has the ability to be biased, because you could buy a tube that runs way hotter than the current tubes that are in your amp And that'll make those tubes run super hot. And not only will it make your amp sound different, it'll make it sound fatter and warmer and possibly muddier if the power tubes have too much current going to them, but it'll also wear your power tubes out a lot faster. So there are a couple of good reasons to bias your amp if it requires it whenever you change tubes. And those are the reasons. Nobody wants to go through power tubes faster than they need to, especially now because they're getting harder to get a hold of with all the supply issues going on in the world right now. So yeah, if your amp requires a bias, either replace the power tubes with the same tubes, same rating that are already on them, or make sure to have the amp rebiased properly. Mustang Guy asks, hey Kyle, question for next FAQ'N Friday. If you were to put together a rack, what would you use? There's some cool rack gear like the Randall RT250 power amp and all the Synergy stuff, endless tweaking and tone chasing. Thank you very much for your question, man. I have really never thought about putting together a rack setup, and it's mainly because I just think the amps are cooler. No offense and no disrespect to anybody out there who really loves rack gear. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying my personal preference. I like having a wall of amps as opposed to having a big giant rack with a bunch of preamps and a power amp or something in it. It just looks cooler to me. And I like to be able to grab one thing and head out the door. I don't want to grab a huge road case full of stuff and try to carry that around. So with that being said, I am absolutely not opposed to diving into rack gear at some point. It kind of seems to be making somewhat of a resurgence in popularity as of recently. So for me, if I were to throw together a rack setup right now, because I don't know that much about it, I would just go with the Synergy. I'd go with the Synergy Syn 2 module that has 2 preamp slots, and then I'd go with the matching Synergy power amp that was designed by Stephen Fryette, because I know that Fryette's power amp stuff is always top of the line. It's always really good. And I just know that I would be able to get whatever I want out of that. The Synergy modules, while they're not exactly like the amps that they're modeled after, they sound great. I've played 5 or 6 of those modules and every single one has sounded great. So I would have zero reservations throwing something like that together and maybe leaving a couple extra rack spaces for different preamps. But yeah, I know that there's a ton of really cool power amp options out there. I know Mesa has a lot of great rack power amp options. I know that Peavey has a couple cool power amp options that you don't see very often. And honestly, I've seen them go for dirt cheap on Craigslist and stuff like that before and been tempted to grab them just to have them and try it out. But I just figured, what's the point? I don't really know anything about them. So maybe at some point in the near future, if I get to a place where I feel like maybe I need to work some rack stuff in because the amp stuff is getting too boring and kind of mix it up a little bit, then maybe I'll dive into the rack rabbit hole. But I don't really want to do that because more than likely what's going to happen is I'm going to like it, I'm going to be really into it, and then I'm going to have to go out and acquire a whole bunch of rack gear on top of all the other crap that I already have. So that is not ideal for my current situation, but I am definitely not opposed to it. G. Caro asks, hey Kyle, question for your next FAQ'N Friday. What do you think of the Peavey Penta? On paper, this amp seems really cool. Love the show. Thank you for the question, and glad you liked the show, man. Thanks for being here. My opinion on the Peavey Penta is this. I don't like it. I waited years and years to try one of these amps because I thought, in theory, like you said, on paper, it sounds like it would be just a really awesome amp to kind of cover all eras of guitar tones, all the way, starting with great kind of Fendery cleans, all the way to super modern high gain stuff. So there's 5 different settings on the Peavey Penta, and it's like a Fendery clean, kind of like a Marshall-y clean, and then a Marshall overdrive. And then the very last setting is supposed to be, it's got the mud flap girl, which why they chose that, I have no idea. It's already a completely reviled design on the Peavey XXX, and I'm assuming that that's what that portion of the voicing was supposed to sound like, a Peavey XXX. In my opinion, it didn't really sound like it. And if it does, it sounds like the Peavey XXX in a way that I would never dial it. It was very buzzy, very scooped, very bass heavy, and I just don't go for that tone whatsoever, and I couldn't really work it out of it. Now, as far as the other tones, all the lower gain tones, pretty much everything but the mud flap girl setting was really good for what it was. Now, I'm not a clean player, I'm not really an edge of breakup player, and I'm not really a low gain player. So while those tones sounded good, I just knew that I was never gonna use the amp for those things, and I really wanted to see how the Mud Flap Girl setting was, if it was like the Triple X, and if the settings before that could be boosted enough to the point where I could use them for thrash metal stuff, and unfortunately they just didn't have enough gain on tap to get there. So in the end, I found that the amp just didn't work for me. The Mud Flap Girl setting was pretty bad in my opinion, and I'm generally a fan of all things PV high gain. I just couldn't get along with it. And the other settings were good, but they're just not what I typically would go after. They're just not high enough gain, not aggressive enough. So it's a cool amp for sure. If you find one for a great price and you know what it's going to offer, you've played it, and it's something that you want in your arsenal, for sure grab it. But if you've never played it and the price is a little higher and you're on the fence and you've got to get rid of something to grab it, I personally wouldn't recommend it, because I think that you can get better high gain tones out of a PV Triple X that you can get used for around the same price if that's what you're going for. So that's just my opinion on it. If you're going for high gain tones, I would say go ahead and pass it. All right, last question for today comes from Brandon Bryson, and he asks, so we all know you're an E standard guy, but when the drop C mood strikes, what is the best amp you've owned for lower tunings? Thank you for your question, man. Best amp I've owned for lower tunings has got to be a PV 5152 or 6505 plus. I'm sure that's not the answer that you guys want to hear, because I do get all sorts of awesome and kind of exotic amps on the channel and everything. You were probably expecting to hear something like a Bogner Uberschall or a Dietzel Herbert or something more exotic. But man, for me, every time I plug in my 6505 plus or my original PV 5150, all I can think of is, this is so good. I've been trying so long to find a tone that beats this for so many years, and in most situations I still tend to find myself preferring the tone of a 6505 plus or a 5150 to anything else that I'm comparing it to. So I know that's not the most exciting answer, and I'm sorry guys, you probably wanted to hear something a little bit more interesting out of me, but that's the truth. That's my go-to. If we were to rule the 6505 plus and the 5150 out of it, there's a few amps that I would certainly consider for that. One of them would be my Dietzel Herbert. I absolutely love that amp. It's a brutal sounding amp. It's got a very specific voicing to it that sounds great. The PV Triple X would be another one that comes to mind for drop C stuff that just sounds, you can make it sound big and thick and mean, but you can also make it sound very tight and precise, so there's a lot of range to dial that amp in. So when you go down to drop C type settings, man, that amp just sounds absolutely fantastic if you want to tighten it up. Not all amps tighten up very well once you start dropping to the lower tunings, but that is one that you can kind of get your desired thickness and low end reaction out of just about any tuning. So I've always loved the Triple X for that, and that's why it always stays in kind of my top tier of amps for tuning down lower. Otherwise, man, that's tough. I mean, I tend to not really like Marshall style amps when I tune down lower. I don't really like the hot rodded Marshalls like the JCM 2000 and stuff like that. They just have a certain voicing that doesn't sit right with my ear. Even my Splons, which you guys know that I love my Splon stuff, it just never quite sounds right when I drop the tuning on those to my ear. So those ones I usually typically rule out. The Mezza Barba stuff can sound really brutal in drop tunings too, but you have to have the right overdrive to really tighten the low end up, because those amps inherently are pretty loose on the low end and they take to boosts really, really well. But when you drop that tuning, things start to get bigger on the low end. You got bigger strings, and then you're getting more low frequencies due to the nature of the tuning. So you got to get something like an Electric Eye Mud Killer, or even like a Fortin 33. It's not my favorite pedal, but it works pretty well on some amps to tighten up that low end on a really loose sounding amp. Another honorable mention for me would be the right Mesa dual or triple rectifier, because you guys know I've said this many times, they seem to vary a lot. I've tried a whole bunch of different ones, and some of them sound killer and some of them don't sound that good. So right now I've got my modded triple rectifier and I've got my dual rectifier multi-watt. Both of those amps with the Mud Killer or a Deadwell Duality on the TC preamp side, or a Dirty Tree, all sound really nasty when you tune low. They just need a little bit of work from the right boost in order to get them where I personally like them, to keep things percussive without sounding too muddy and everything. So yeah, PV 5152 or 5150, Triple X, Dietzel Herbert, everything else kind of falls behind that in my opinion, for my own personal tastes when tuning down to drop C. And that is gonna do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for the questions. I really enjoyed this week's questions. There were some good ones in there, especially the ones about the rack gear. That's kind of got my brain turning a little bit, and the impulse responses are something that I definitely want to look into for you guys in the near future. So again, put it down in the comments. Let me know if that's something you're interested in having custom impulse response packs of my own personal cabs. And for next week, put your questions down in the comments. That's like 3 weeks in a row that I got that right. And I will be sure to do my absolute best to get to them. Now remember, next week again is going to be the first viewers comments episode. So put your questions down below of this episode. I will come back and revisit it in 2 weeks when I do the next FAQ'N Friday episode. Down in the description of this video are my Sweetwater affiliate links and my Patreon links. Both of those massively help me out if you guys go down and visit those. I greatly appreciate you if you do. You can also support the channel by becoming a member of the Belligerent Amateur community by joining my Facebook group and my Discord server. Not my Discord group and my Facebook server, as I say all the time. But yeah, go down there, click on those links, join those groups. I'd be happy to have you guys become part of the community around this channel. Until next time, guys, thanks so much for watching. Kyle here again. We'll see you next time.